A farmer's wife helped an accident victim on a deserted highway, but 3 days later, 20 ambulances arrived, bringing something she never expected. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the endless cornfields of Millbrook County, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Margaret Wilson stood on the weathered porch of the farmhouse that had been in her husband's family for 4 generations, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh soil and early autumn. At 52, her face bore the lines of a woman who had weathered life's storms with quiet resilience. Her once auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes remained as sharp and clear as the day James had first fallen in love with them nearly 30 years ago. "Going into town early today," she called over her shoulder, knowing James was already in the kitchen, nursing his first cup of coffee. "Need to get those supplies before the storm hits." Weather forecasters had been warning about a significant system moving through the Midwest, and years of farming had taught them never to ignore such warnings. Preparation wasn't just prudent, it was survival. James appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, his tall frame slightly stooped from decades of physical labor. "Take the truck," he said, tossing her the keys. "Heard on the radio the back roads are washing out already from the rain up north." Margaret nodded, catching the keys with practiced ease. Their old pickup had seen better days, but it was sturdy and reliable, much like their marriage. As she climbed into the driver's seat, she glanced at the sky. Despite the beautiful sunrise, dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon. She needed to hurry. The 20-mile drive to Hartville, the nearest town with a decent supply store, usually took about 30 minutes. Today, Margaret decided to take Highway 27, a longer route, but one that would be less susceptible to flooding. The narrow 2-lane highway stretched before her, eerily empty. Most locals had likely heeded the weather warnings and completed their errands the previous day. She was about 15 miles from town when she saw it. A dark sedan, its front end crumpled against the guardrail on the opposite side of the highway. The vehicle was partially obscured by the tall grass that lined the road, and Margaret realized with a start that if she'd been driving faster or paying less attention, she might have missed it entirely. Margaret slowed the pickup, pulling onto the shoulder. No other vehicles were in sight, and something in her gut told her this wasn't right. The accident looked fresh, yet there were no emergency vehicles, no flashing lights, no signs that help had arrived. She grabbed her cell phone from her purse. No signal. Not unusual for this stretch of highway, nestled as it was between 2 hills that blocked reception. Without hesitation, Margaret stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. "Hello," she called, approaching the vehicle cautiously. "Anyone there? Do you need help?" As she drew closer, Margaret could see a figure slumped against the steering wheel. A young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair matted with blood across her forehead. She was unconscious but breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven intervals. Training from her years as a volunteer firefighter before the children were born kicked in. Margaret checked for immediate dangers. No smoke, no fuel leaks, no fire. The woman was wearing a seatbelt, which had likely saved her life, but the deployed airbag and crumpled front end spoke to the force of the impact. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Margaret asked, reaching through the partially open window to check the woman's pulse. It was rapid but strong. Good sign. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of burnished copper. Confusion gave way to panic as she tried to move, then winced in pain. "Don't move," Margaret instructed firmly but gently. "You've been in an accident. I'm going to help you." "My phone," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Need to call?" "No reception out here," Margaret explained. "I'm going to get you to safety, then call for help." "What's your name?" "Elena," the woman managed. "Elena Reyes." "I'm Margaret Wilson. You're going to be okay, Elena." A quick assessment told Margaret that while Elena needed medical attention, There were no immediately life-threatening injuries that she could see. The woman was conscious, oriented, and her breathing, though labored, was steady. The greatest danger now was the approaching storm. They needed to get to shelter. Making a quick decision, Margaret returned to her truck and backed it up as close as possible to Elena's vehicle. The less distance Elena had to move, the better. Opening the passenger door of her pickup, Margaret prepared to help Elena from the wreckage. "I think my leg is broken," Elena said, her voice stronger now but tight with pain. "And my ribs. It hurts to breathe." "We'll take it slow," Margaret assured her. "But we need to get you out of here. That storm's coming in fast, and this road floods easily." As if on cue, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, splattering against the windshield of Elena's crumpled sedan. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. With careful movements that belied her age, Margaret helped Elena unfasten her seatbelt and ease out of the driver's seat. Elena cried out once when her injured leg shifted, but otherwise remained stoically silent as Margaret supported her weight and guided her into the passenger seat of the pickup. By the time Margaret closed the door and circled around to the driver's side, the rain was falling in earnest, heavy sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Margaret turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. "We're about 40 minutes from the hospital in Hartville," she told Elena, pulling back onto the highway. "But I'm worried about the roads washing out. My farm is closer, about 10 minutes back the way I came. We have a landline there, and my husband's a former Army medic. He can help stabilize you until we can get emergency services." Elena nodded weakly, her face pale against the dark upholstery. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Margaret didn't say what they both knew, that with the storm intensifying and the road so rarely traveled, it might have been hours, even days before anyone else found her. Hours Elena might not have had. The rain was falling so heavily now that Margaret had to slow to a crawl, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated the increasingly treacherous road. Twice, the pickup hydroplaned slightly, causing Elena to gasp in pain as she was jostled. "Almost there," Margaret assured her, though she was beginning to worry. The ditches alongside the highway were already filling with water, and the fields beyond were turning into shallow lakes. Finally, the familiar outline of the Wilson farm appeared through the curtain of rain. Margaret turned onto the gravel driveway, now slick with mud, the pickup's tires struggling for traction. James must have heard them coming. He was already on the porch, his tall figure silhouetted against the light from the open door. As Margaret pulled up as close to the house as possible, he jogged out to meet them, rain plastering his gray hair to his forehead. "We've got an injured woman," Margaret called over the roar of the downpour. "Accident on Highway 27. No cell service to call for help." James nodded, immediately opening the passenger door. "I'm James," he said to Elena, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm going to carry you inside. Try to stay still." With a gentleness that belied his weathered exterior, James lifted Elena from the seat, careful to support her injured leg. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, a single tear mingling with the raindrops on her cheek. Inside, Margaret quickly cleared the sofa in the living room, laying down plastic sheeting from James's medical kit, then a clean blanket. As James carefully set Elena down, Margaret was already on the phone, dialing 911. "Emergency services," she reported when the dispatcher answered. "Single vehicle accident on Highway 27, approximately 15 miles east of Hartville. Female victim, early 30s, conscious with suspected broken leg and possible rib fractures. We've transported her to our location due to the storm." As she gave their address and answered the dispatcher's questions, James was already examining Elena, his movements methodical and precise, drawing on training that, though decades old, was deeply ingrained. "Ambulance is on the way," Margaret said, hanging up. "But the dispatcher warned there are already reports of flooding. It might take them some time to reach us." James nodded grimly. We'll do what we can in the meantime." He turned to Elena, who was watching them both with eyes glazed with pain but alert. "I need to check your injuries more thoroughly. Is that okay?" Elena nodded weakly. "Are you really a medic?" "Army medic. 2 tours in Desert Storm," James confirmed. "Been a while, but some things you don't forget." As James carefully examined Elena's injuries, Margaret gathered supplies: clean towels, bottled water, the first aid kit they kept well stocked, living so far from town. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the corners of the old farmhouse. "Definitely a broken tibia," James reported after gently probing Elena's swollen leg. "And at least 2 cracked ribs. But her pupils are equal and reactive, breathing is regular, and pulse is strong. I'm more concerned about internal injuries we can't see." Margaret nodded, handing him what he needed to create a makeshift splint for Elena's leg. As James worked, she dampened a clean cloth and gently wiped the blood from Elena's forehead, revealing a nasty gash that had thankfully stopped bleeding. "You're going to be okay," Margaret assured Elena, who had closed her eyes against the pain. "Help is coming." But as the minutes stretched into an hour and the storm showed no signs of abating, Margaret began to worry. A call back to emergency services confirmed her fears. Roads were flooding throughout the county, and emergency vehicles were struggling to get through. "They'll get here as soon as they can," she told James quietly. "But it might be a while." James nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Then we do what needs doing," he said simply. It was how they had always faced challenges, together, pragmatically, one step at a time. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret made soup and tea, helping Elena sip slowly from a mug while James monitored her condition. They learned that Elena was a researcher from the university in the city, traveling to collect data when she'd swerved to avoid a deer and lost control on the wet pavement. "My colleagues will be worried," Elena said, her voice stronger now, though pain still etched lines around her mouth. "I was supposed to check in hours ago." "As soon as the phones are working again, we'll call anyone you need," Margaret promised. But as evening approached and the storm continued unabated, it became clear that Elena would be spending the night. The Wilsons prepared their guest bedroom, and James carefully carried Elena upstairs, settling her on the bed with her injured leg elevated. "Thank you," Elena said as Margaret tucked a quilt around her. "I don't know many people who would do this for a stranger." Margaret smiled, the warmth reaching her eyes. "Out here we take care of each other. Get some rest now." As she turned to leave, Elena caught her hand. "There's something you should know," she said, her copper eyes suddenly intense. "I'm not just a researcher. What I was carrying in my car, it's important. Very important." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "What do you mean?" Elena glanced toward the door, then back at Margaret. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And then, I need your help." Elena reached beneath the quilt with a grimace of pain and pulled a slim metal case from the pocket of her jacket. It was no larger than a paperback book, dented slightly at one corner, but otherwise intact. "This is what I was gathering data for," she explained, her voice low despite the empty hallway behind Margaret. "It contains samples of a new bacteria strain that could revolutionize treatment for antibiotic-resistant infections." Margaret's eyes widened. "You're a medical researcher?" Elena nodded. "Microbiologist. I was on my way back from a rural hospital that's been battling an unusual outbreak. What's in this case could potentially save thousands of lives, but there are pharmaceutical companies that would rather see my research buried." She pressed the case into Margaret's hands. "The samples need refrigeration within 24 hours of collection. They've been in specialized cooling containers, but with the accident..." She trailed off, eyes pleading. "Is there any way we could get this to your refrigerator?" Margaret stared at the unassuming metal case, suddenly aware of its weight, both literal and figurative, in her hands. "Of course," she said, mind racing. But shouldn't we call someone? Your laboratory or the university? Elena shook her head, wincing at the movement. Not yet. There may be people monitoring those communications. This research has powerful enemies. It could render billions in antibiotics obsolete. She hesitated, then added, I wasn't completely truthful before. The deer I swerved to avoid? I think it might have been forced into the road. I saw headlights behind me just before the accident, but they disappeared immediately after. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She'd read about corporate espionage, but it had always seemed like something from movies, not something that would touch her quiet life in Millbrook County. James needs to know, Margaret said firmly. I don't keep secrets from my husband. Elena studied her face, then nodded slowly. I understand, but please, be careful. The fewer people who know about this, the safer everyone will be. Margaret tucked the case under her arm. Try to rest. I'll take care of this. Downstairs, James was stoking the fire in the hearth, the flickering flames casting shadows across his weathered face. He looked up as Margaret entered, immediately noticing her troubled expression. What is it? He asked, straightening. Margaret carefully explained what Elena had told her, showing him the metal case. James listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grave. So she believes someone might have deliberately run her off the road? He asked finally, taking the case and examining it. She thinks it's possible, Margaret confirmed, and she's worried about getting these samples refrigerated. James nodded thoughtfully. Our generator should hold if the power goes out. Let's get this into the fridge, and then figure out our next steps. The old refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a reassuring sound amid the howling storm outside. James carefully placed the metal case on an empty shelf, away from their food items. If what she's saying is true, he said, closing the refrigerator door, then we might be in the middle of something dangerous. Margaret leaned against the counter, suddenly feeling every one of her 52 years. I couldn't just leave her there, James. He reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. I know. And you did the right thing. We both did. But now we need to be smart about this. They decided that James would stay up in shifts through the night, watching for any unusual activity, while Margaret would check on Elena regularly. Their landline was working only intermittently due to the storm, but they managed to get through to emergency services again, who confirmed that road conditions had worsened and that help would likely not arrive until morning. As midnight approached, the storm reached its peak. Wind battered the farmhouse, rain drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Margaret had just checked on Elena, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep when James called her to the window in the living room. There, he said, pointing through the rain-streaked glass. On the road. Margaret squinted into the darkness. At first she saw nothing but the curtain of rain, illuminated by their porch light. Then she caught it, the faint gleam of headlights moving slowly along the county road that ran past their farm. The lights paused near their driveway, then continued, disappearing around the bend. Could be emergency services, Margaret suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. James shook his head. They'd have come up the drive, and they would have called first. They retreated from the window, James checking that his old shotgun was loaded and within reach, a precaution he hadn't taken in years. Margaret made a fresh pot of coffee. Neither of them would be sleeping much tonight. Around 2 a.m, the storm began to abate, the wind dying down to occasional gusts, the rain lessening to a steady patter rather than a deluge. Margaret dozed in the armchair, jolting awake when James touched her shoulder. Phone's working again, he said. I got through to Sheriff Dennison. He's sending a deputy out at first light, and the ambulance should be able to get through once the water recedes a bit. Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. How's Elena? Still sleeping. Her fever's up a bit, but that's to be expected with the trauma. I gave her some ibuprofen around midnight. Margaret rose, stretching muscles stiff from the awkward position. "I'll check on her. You should try to get some sleep." As she climbed the stairs, Margaret found herself wondering about Elena Reyes. The young woman had quite literally crashed into their lives less than 24 hours ago, bringing with her a storm of complications beyond the weather. Yet Margaret couldn't bring herself to regret stopping on that lonely stretch of highway. Whatever trouble Elena had brought with her, leaving her to die would have been unthinkable. Elena was awake when Margaret entered the guest bedroom, her copper eyes bright with fever in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "The storm's letting up," Margaret said quietly, placing a cool cloth on Elena's forehead. "Help should be here in the morning." Elena caught her wrist. "Were there cars? On the road?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "One. A few hours ago. It passed by without stopping." Fear flickered across Elena's face. "They're looking for me. For what I was carrying." "The samples are safe," Margaret assured her. "And my husband's keeping watch. Try not to worry." But worry was etched in every line of Elena's face. "You don't understand. These people, they're not just corporate spies. There's more at stake than patents or profits." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "Then help me understand." Elena closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "The bacteria I've been studying doesn't just resist antibiotics. It breaks them down, renders them inert. In a controlled medical setting, it could be revolutionary. Targeted bacteria that destroy antibiotics only after they've done their job, preventing the development of resistance." "But in the wrong hands?" Margaret prompted, already suspecting the answer. "In the wrong hands, it could be weaponized. Imagine a biological agent that neutralizes antibiotics in the bloodstream, leaving victims defenseless against secondary infections." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "My research partner believed someone on our team was selling information. He died in a lab accident 3 weeks ago." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "And now they're after you." Elena nodded weakly. "I have proof, not just of the potential medical applications, but of the security breach. It's all on a drive hidden in the lining of the case. Once I get it to the right authorities—" She trailed off, exhaustion overtaking her. "Rest now," Margaret said, adjusting the quilt. "We'll figure this out in the morning." As she closed the guest room door behind her, Margaret's mind raced with the implications of Elena's revelations. What had started as a simple act of kindness, stopping to help an accident victim, had plunged them into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Downstairs, she found James dozing in his recliner, the shotgun balanced across his lap. She gently woke him, relaying what Elena had told her. James ran a hand over his face, stubble rasping against his palm. "We're out of our depth here, Maggie." "I know," she admitted. "But we're all she has right now." The first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky when Margaret, peering through the kitchen window as she made a fresh pot of coffee, spotted movement at the end of their long driveway. A dark SUV moving slowly through the receding floodwaters, headlights cutting through the misty morning light. "James!" she called, her voice urgent but controlled. "Someone's coming!" He was beside her in an instant, peering through the rain-streaked glass. "Not the sheriff," he muttered, recognizing the vehicle wasn't from the department, and not an ambulance. As they watched, the SUV stopped at the gate to their property. 2 figures emerged, dressed in dark clothing, their movements purposeful as they approached the chain, securing the gate. "Get upstairs to Elena," James instructed, reaching for his shotgun. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me." Margaret hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone. "Go," he insisted. "I'll be fine, just make sure she's safe." Heart pounding, Margaret hurried up the stairs. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing with certainty. The simple life they had known was changing irrevocably, transformed by a chance encounter on a storm-swept highway. Margaret burst into the guest bedroom, startling Elena awake. "Someone's here," she explained quickly, moving to help Elena sit up. "Not the sheriff, not an ambulance." Elena's face drained of what little color it had regained. "It's them," she whispered, grimacing as she tried to shift position. "They found me." "James is downstairs," Margaret said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "We need to move you somewhere safer." "I can't walk," Elena protested. "I'll help you," Margaret insisted, already gathering the quilt around Elena's shoulders. "We have a root cellar. Old storm shelter, really. Entrance is hidden in the pantry. James and I are the only ones who know about it." With surprising strength for her frame, Margaret supported Elena as she hobbled across the hallway, down the servants' staircase that led directly to the kitchen. Every movement clearly caused Elena excruciating pain, but she bit her lip and kept moving, her breath coming in sharp bursts. They paused at the bottom of the stairs. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see James on the porch, shotgun visible but pointed at the ground. A warning, not a threat. The two figures had reached the front gate and were now attempting to open it, undeterred by the chain and padlock securing it. "This way," Margaret whispered, helping Elena across the kitchen to the walk-in pantry. At the back, behind shelves of home-canned vegetables and preserves, a narrow door led to a steep staircase descending into darkness. Margaret flicked a switch, illuminating a bare bulb that cast long shadows down the stairs. "It's not much," Margaret apologized as they carefully navigated the steps, "but it's dry and solid, built during the Cold War by James's father." The root cellar was small but surprisingly well appointed. Shelves of supplies, a cot against one wall, even a small chemical toilet behind a privacy screen. Margaret helped Elena onto the cot. "We keep it stocked for tornado season," she explained, pulling a first aid kit from a shelf. "There's water, some food, even a battery-powered radio." Elena looked around, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. "What about the samples? The case?" "Still in the refrigerator upstairs," Margaret admitted. "I didn't have time." "They can't get those samples," Elena interrupted, her voice suddenly fierce despite her weakened state. "Or the drive with my research. It would be catastrophic." Margaret hesitated, torn between staying with Elena and retrieving the case. "I'll go back up," she decided. "James will need help anyway. Here." She pressed a small two-way radio into Elena's hand. "It's old, but it works. We use it during harvest. Press this button to talk to me." Elena clutched the radio. "Be careful," she pleaded. "These people are professionals. They won't hesitate to hurt you or your husband." Margaret nodded grimly. "We may be farmers, Dr. Reyes, but we're not helpless." She turned to go, then paused. The door locks from the inside. "Don't open it for anyone but James or me." Back upstairs, Margaret grabbed the metal case from the refrigerator and quickly stashed it in a flour bin, a temporary hiding place, but better than leaving it in plain sight. Through the window, she could see that the situation on the porch had escalated. The intruders had cut the chain on the gate and were now standing at the bottom of the porch steps, facing off with James. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped dark hair, dressed in what looked like tactical gear beneath a dark jacket. The other was a slender woman with blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, wearing similar attire. Both had the cold, assessing eyes of predators. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself, then stepped out onto the porch beside her husband. "This is private property," James was saying, his voice level but firm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The woman smiled, the expression never reaching her eyes. "We apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Wilson. My name is Dr. Vega, and this is my colleague, Mr. Mercer. We're from the Centers for Disease Control." She held up an identification card that Margaret couldn't read from this distance. "We're tracking a potentially dangerous pathogen," Dr. Vega continued smoothly. We have reason to believe that a researcher who was transporting sensitive materials was involved in an accident somewhere in this area yesterday." "Haven't seen anyone," James replied, his expression neutral. "Roads have been flooded since yesterday afternoon. You're the first visitors we've had." Mr. Mercer stepped forward, his stance subtly threatening. "We have satellite tracking that indicates the researcher's vehicle stopped on the highway not far from here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And then the tracking device went offline. Are you sure there's no one here besides you and your wife?" Margaret felt a chill at the casual mention of her presence. They had done their research before arriving. "Just us," James confirmed. "If I see anyone matching your description, who should I call?" Dr. Vega produced a business card, holding it out. "This number will reach us directly. It's imperative we locate Dr. Reyes as quickly as possible. She may not understand the dangers of what she's carrying." James stepped forward to take the card, deliberately keeping his movement slow and non-threatening. As he did, Mercer's gaze shifted, scanning the farmhouse windows, the barn in the distance, the muddy driveway where just the faintest impression of tire tracks, Margaret's truck from yesterday, remained. Margaret recognized the tactical assessment for what it was. These were not CDC officials. They were hunters, and Elena was their prey. "If that's all," James said, stepping back beside Margaret, "we have chores waiting. Storm did a lot of damage." Dr. Vega's smile tightened fractionally. "Of course. We won't take up any more of your time." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, one more thing. If you do see Dr. Reyes, please don't approach her directly. The materials she's carrying could be contaminated. For your own safety, just call us immediately." As the pair retreated down the driveway toward their SUV, Margaret and James maintained their positions on the porch, arms casually touching, a united front. "They're not CDC," James murmured once the visitors were out of earshot. "I know," Margaret agreed. "Elena's in the root cellar. She says these people are after her research, something that could neutralize antibiotics. Potentially a weapon." James's expression hardened. "They'll be back," he predicted grimly. "That was just a reconnaissance. They're not convinced." Inside the house, Margaret quickly briefed James on what Elena had told her about the hidden drive in the case lining. They retrieved the case from its hiding place in the flour bin. "We need to get her and this research to safety," James said, examining the case carefully. "But how? Roads are still flooded in most directions." Margaret's eyes fell on the business card Dr. Vega had given James. "Maybe we can use the enemy's resources against them," she suggested. "Let me make a call." 30 minutes later, Margaret put down the phone, her expression resolute. "Sheriff Dennison says the main roads should be passable in a few hours. He's sending Deputy Wallace out as soon as possible." "Wallace is a good man," James agreed. "But one deputy against those two professionals. It buys us time, at least," Margaret reasoned. "And I have an idea about how to get Elena to safety, but we'll need help." She outlined her plan to James, who listened with growing appreciation. "That's brilliant, Maggie. Risky, but brilliant. I need to go explain it to Elena, see if she thinks it could work." In the root cellar, Elena had managed to prop herself up on the cot, her injured leg stretched out before her, face pale but determined. Margaret quickly explained about their visitors and her plan. "It could work," Elena agreed, her analytical mind working through the variables despite her pain. "But you and your husband would be putting yourselves in serious danger. These people, the organization they work for, they don't leave loose ends." "Sometimes the right thing and the safe thing aren't the same," Margaret replied simply. Elena studied her with those penetrating copper eyes. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You could have handed me over to them, been done with all this." Margaret considered the question seriously. "Because you needed help," she said finally, "and because what you're carrying could save lives. My father died of a resistant infection 3 years ago. It was horrible, watching antibiotics fail one after another. If your research could prevent that happening to other families. She shrugged. That's worth fighting for. A noise from upstairs interrupted them. The distant crackle of tires on gravel. Someone's coming, Margaret whispered, reaching for the radio to contact James. His voice came back immediately, tense but controlled. It's Wallace. But he's not alone. There's another vehicle behind him. Ambulance, by the looks of it. Margaret frowned. They hadn't requested an ambulance yet, waiting until their plan was in place. I've got a bad feeling about this, James continued. That woman, Dr. Vega, she's in the passenger seat. Elena's face drained of color. They've co-opted your local authorities, she whispered. That's how they work. Official cover, access to resources. We can't trust anyone now. Margaret's mind raced. Their carefully laid plan was unraveling before they could even put it into action. Whatever happened next, they would be facing it without the help they had counted on. Stay here, she told Elena firmly. No matter what you hear, don't come up unless James or I call for you specifically. Upstairs, Margaret joined James at the window. The deputy's cruiser had pulled up in front of the house, followed by an ambulance marked with the county hospital's logo. As they watched, Deputy Wallace emerged, along with Dr. Vega. From the ambulance, 2 paramedics stepped out, along with the broad-shouldered Mr. Mercer, now wearing a paramedic's uniform that did little to disguise his militaristic bearing. They're coming for her, James said softly. And now they have the law on their side. Margaret and James exchanged a look, loaded with decades of understanding. Without words, they reached the same conclusion. They would not abandon Elena to these people, badge or no badge. I'll do the talking, James murmured, as a knock sounded at the door. Play along. Margaret nodded, smoothing her expression into one of mild confusion as James opened the door. Deputy Wallace stood on their porch, his ruddy face apologetic beneath his regulation hat. At 55, Wallace was a fixture in the county, having served with the sheriff's department for over 30 years. Margaret had known him since high school. Morning, Jim, Margaret, Wallace said, nodding to each of them. Sorry to bother you folks so early, but we've got a situation. This is Dr. Vega from the CDC. He gestured to the blonde woman standing beside him, who offered a tight smile. And those are county paramedics, he added, indicating the ambulance where Mercer and another man in uniform waited. CDC? James echoed, feigning surprise. What brings you all the way out here? Dr. Vega stepped forward. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Wilson, we're tracking a missing researcher who may have been in an accident nearby. Dr. Elena Reyes was transporting sensitive biological materials that could pose a public health risk. Wallace shifted uncomfortably. Jim, they've got satellite data showing a vehicle accident not far from here yesterday afternoon, right around the time Margaret would have been heading to town. He looked at Margaret. Did you see anything on Highway 27? Any vehicle that might have run off the road? Margaret met his gaze steadily. Roads were terrible yesterday, Mike. I ended up turning back before I got halfway to town. Didn't see any accidents. The lie came more easily than she would have expected, justified by the knowledge of what was at stake. Dr. Vega's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. That's interesting, Mrs. Wilson, because our tracking data shows the research vehicle stopped precisely on the stretch of highway you would have traveled. Like I said, I turned back early, Margaret reiterated. Storm was getting bad. Wallace looked relieved at her denial, but Dr. Vega remained skeptical. Would you mind if we took a look around your property? Dr. Reyes may have sought shelter nearby if she survived the accident. Actually, I would mind, James said firmly. Not without a warrant. Wallace blinked in surprise. Jim, this is a potential public health emergency. They're just trying to... I understand, Mike, James interrupted, but we've had a rough night with the storm. Lot of damage to clean up. If you get a warrant, We won't stand in your way. Until then, our property is private." Dr. Vega's professional facade slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of cold anger. "Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. The materials Dr. Reyes was transporting could be extremely dangerous if mishandled. If she came to you for help—" "No one came to us for help," Margaret interjected, her voice firm. "And we've told you we didn't see any accident." A tense silence followed, broken when Wallace's radio crackled to life. "Deputy Wallace, come in," came Sheriff Dennison's voice. Wallace stepped away to respond, his conversation a murmur of official codes and acknowledgments. When he returned, his expression had changed subtly. "Dr. Vega, I just got word that state police found an abandoned vehicle matching Dr. Reyes's rental car about 20 miles east of here. They're requesting CDC presence at the scene immediately." For a moment, Dr. Vega looked genuinely surprised, her composure slipping. She glanced at Mercer, who had approached and was now standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his hand resting casually near his hip, where, Margaret suspected, a weapon was concealed. "We should investigate immediately," Vega decided, though her eyes lingered suspiciously on the Wilsons. "Deputy Wallace, would you escort us to the location?" Wallace nodded. "Of course." He turned to James and Margaret. "Sorry for the disturbance, folks. If you do see or hear anything unusual, give the station a call, all right?" "Will do, Mike," James assured him, his stance relaxing slightly as the group began to retreat toward their vehicles. As they pulled away, Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was close," she whispered. "But they'll be back once they realize there's no second accident site." James nodded grimly. "We don't have much time. Let's get Elena and the case ready to move." They hurried to the root cellar, where Elena was waiting anxiously, the two-way radio clutched in her hand. "I heard everything through the radio," she said as they entered. "They're not giving up." "No," James agreed. "But we've bought a little time. There is no second accident site, is there?" Elena shook her head. "Not that I know of." Margaret explained. "That call was too convenient. Either the sheriff is helping us, or someone else is." "Either way," James said pragmatically, "we need to move before they come back with a warrant, or worse, without one." Margaret outlined her revised plan. Their neighbor, Harvey Miller, owned a crop-dusting business with a small airstrip on his property about 5 miles away. Harvey owed James a favor from years back when James had helped him save his farm during the financial crisis. "If we can get you to Harvey's airstrip," Margaret told Elena, "he might be willing to fly you to the city, to people you trust." Elena considered this. "It could work. I have contacts at the FBI who can be trusted, but I haven't been able to reach them directly since discovering the breach in our lab." "The roads are still compromised in places," James pointed out, "but I think the old logging trail that connects our back 40 to the Miller property should be passable. It's rough going, but my truck can handle it." "How do we get Elena there?" Margaret asked. "She can barely walk." James ran a hand through his gray hair, thinking. "The ATV. It's not comfortable, but it can navigate that trail better than the truck in these conditions." While James went to prepare the all-terrain vehicle they used for checking fence lines on the far reaches of their property, Margaret helped Elena gather her strength. She found clean clothes that would fit the younger woman and helped her change, then redressed her wound with fresh bandages. "Here," Margaret said, pressing a bottle of water and some painkillers into Elena's hand. "These will help with the journey. It won't be smooth." Elena swallowed the pills gratefully. "I can't thank you enough," she said softly. "You and your husband, you're risking everything for me, for my research." Margaret smiled slightly as she packed a small bag with supplies. "James always said I had more courage than sense, but some things are worth fighting for." "If we get through this," Elena said, her copper eyes intense, I promise your kindness won't be forgotten." James returned 20 minutes later, his clothes splattered with mud. "ATV's ready, hidden in the back of the barn. We need to move now. I spotted a drone overhead. They're still searching the area." Margaret tensed. Electronic surveillance. They're not giving up. With James on one side and Margaret on the other, they helped Elena up the cellar stairs and through the kitchen. Moving as quickly as possible while still mindful of Elena's injuries, they crossed the muddy yard to the barn, keeping to the shadows cast by the early morning sun. The old barn housed not only their tractor and farm equipment, but generations of accumulated tools and machinery. Near the back door, covered with a tarp, waited their rugged ATV. James had already attached a small trailer to it, not much more than a flatbed with sides, but it would allow Elena to lie down during the journey. "I've cushioned it as much as possible," James explained, "but it's still going to be a rough ride." They helped Elena into the trailer, covering her with a tarp for both protection from the elements and concealment. Margaret tucked the precious metal case beside her, wrapped in a waterproof bag. "I'll drive," James said. "Margaret, you follow in the truck. If we get separated, meet at Harvey's North Field." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As she turned to head for their pickup, a sound from outside froze her in place. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. James quickly doused the barn lights. In the sudden darkness, they could hear car doors slamming, followed by footsteps approaching the house. "They're back already," Margaret whispered. "How?" "The second accident site must not have fooled them for long," James murmured. "Or they split their forces." Through a crack in the barn door, they could see the SUV parked in front of their house. Mercer was approaching the front door, his hand now openly resting on a holstered weapon. There was no sign of Dr. Vega, Wallace, or the ambulance. "They're not even pretending anymore," Margaret observed, a chill running down her spine. "No warrant, no deputy." James's expression hardened. "They've shown their true colors. Our priority now is getting Elena to safety." He turned to the injured woman. "Dr. Reyes, we need to go now, while they're focused on the house." Elena nodded weakly from the trailer. "I'm ready." James started the ATV, its engine thankfully quieter than most, due to his regular maintenance. "Stay low," he instructed Elena. "Margaret, give us a 5-minute head start, then create a diversion before following. We need to split their attention." Margaret nodded, already formulating a plan. She pressed a quick kiss to James's weathered cheek. "Be careful," she whispered. "You too," he replied, his eyes conveying everything words couldn't. As James carefully guided the ATV toward the barn's back door, which opened onto fields leading away from the house, Margaret slipped toward the side entrance. From there, she had a clear view of Mercer now pounding on their front door, his patience clearly wearing thin. Taking a deep breath, Margaret steeled herself for what came next: the safety of Elena, and potentially thousands who could benefit from her research, now depended on a farmer's wife from Millbrook County and her ability to outthink professionals who killed without remorse. Behind her, the ATV's engine faded as James and Elena made their escape across the back fields. Margaret checked her watch, counting down the minutes before she would make her move. Outside, Mercer had stopped knocking and was speaking into a radio, his posture tense and alert. Margaret clutched the barn door handle, waiting for the right moment to launch her diversion. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the quiet life they had known yesterday morning. 5 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Margaret watched as Mercer circled the house, peering through windows, testing doors. She had no illusions about his intentions. If he found Elena, both the researcher and the evidence she carried would disappear. And the Wilsons? Margaret shuddered to think what might become of them once they were no longer useful. It was time. Drawing a deep breath, Margaret set her plan into motion. Their farm's emergency generator stood behind the house, a hulking piece of machinery that had seen them through countless power outages over the years. Margaret had already loosened the fuel line earlier while James was preparing the ATV. Now she aimed the shotgun James had left for her and squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed across the property, followed immediately by a whoosh as the spilled diesel ignited. It wasn't a massive explosion. Margaret had been careful to create a distraction, not a disaster. But the sudden flames and smoke billowing behind the house had the desired effect. Mercer spun toward the commotion, drawing his weapon. As he raced toward the fire, Margaret slipped from the barn to the truck, keeping low. The engine roared to life, and she reversed quickly, then swung the vehicle around and accelerated down the driveway, away from both the house and the direction James had taken. In the rearview mirror, she saw Mercer running back toward the front of the house, shouting into his radio. Good. Let him think they were all fleeing together. With any luck, he'd follow her while James and Elena made their way safely to Harvey's airstrip. Margaret pushed the old pickup as fast as she dared on the muddy roads. Her plan was simple, but risky. Led Mercer away from the farm, then double back through the network of service roads she knew like the back of her hand. Locals called it the Maze, a confusing patchwork of unmarked dirt roads used primarily by farmers to access remote fields. Someone not from Millbrook County would be easily disoriented. Within minutes, she spotted a dark SUV in her rearview mirror, gaining rapidly. Mercer had taken the bait. Margaret allowed herself a grim smile as she approached a fork in the road. Taking the left branch, she accelerated briefly, then abruptly pulled onto a concealed turnoff, killing the engine. Heart pounding, she watched as the SUV sped past her hiding spot. Perfect. She waited 30 seconds, then restarted the truck and took the other fork, heading back toward the farm via a circuitous route that would eventually connect with the logging trail James had mentioned. Meanwhile, James was navigating the ATV carefully through waterlogged fields and patches of dense woodland. The logging trail, little more than a rutted path that hadn't seen regular use in decades, was challenging even in good conditions. After the storm, sections had turned into muddy morasses that threatened to trap the wheels of the ATV. Elena lay in the trailer, clutching the sides as they bounced over uneven terrain. Each jolt sent spikes of pain through her injured leg, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the canopy of trees overhead, visible through the gaps in the tarp. "You doing all right back there?" James called over the rumble of the engine. "I'm managing," Elena replied through gritted teeth. "How much farther?" "About 3 miles to Harvey's place," James answered. "But the worst of the trail is behind us." They emerged from a thicket into a clearing that offered a brief respite of smoother ground. James took the opportunity to check on Elena and their surroundings. No signs of pursuit yet, but he knew better than to assume they weren't being searched for. "We need to keep moving," he said, helping Elena take a sip of water. "Can you hold on a bit longer?" Elena nodded resolutely. "I've come too far to give up now." As James restarted the ATV, a distant mechanical buzzing caught his attention. He looked up, scanning the sky, and spotted it, a small drone, its camera glinting in the morning sun, hovering several hundred yards away. "We've got company," he warned Elena, quickly pulling the tarp more securely over her and the trailer. "Stay covered." The drone was moving in a search pattern, methodically scanning the area. It hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. James diverted from their planned route, guiding the ATV into a denser section of woods where the canopy would provide cover from aerial surveillance. Back on the county roads, Margaret had successfully evaded Mercer's pursuit and was now approaching the western edge of their property, where a seldom-used tractor path would allow her to access the logging trail. The truck bounced violently as she navigated the rough terrain, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. A sudden movement in her peripheral vision caused her to slam on the brakes. Deputy Wallace stepped out from behind a tree, his hand raised in a signal to stop. Margaret's first instinct was to accelerate past him. If he was working with Dr. Vega, he couldn't be trusted. but something in his expression gave her pause. She rolled down the window as he approached, her hand resting near the shotgun on the passenger seat. "They're not CDC," Wallace said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Sheriff figured that out when he ran a check on their credentials. They're private military contractors working for Ascendant Pharmaceuticals." Margaret stared at him, absorbing this information. "You know about Elena?" Wallace nodded grimly. "Found her rental car where you left it on the highway. Hidden it at the impound lot, off the books." He glanced over his shoulder nervously. "Sheriff's stalling them with paperwork at the station, but they've got people all over the county looking for her." "Why are you helping us?" Margaret asked, still wary. Wallace's weathered face softened. "Known you and James 30 years, Margaret. If you're protecting this woman, you've got good reason." He handed her a satellite phone. "Sheriff sent me to give you this. It's secure, not traceable like cell phones. He's made some calls, got people coming who can help. Real federal agents." Margaret took the phone, hope flickering for the first time since this ordeal began. "James is taking Elena to Harvey Miller's airstrip. She has research that could save countless lives, but Ascendant wants to bury it to protect their profits." Wallace nodded. "That tracks with what we've pieced together. Those Ascendant folks have some serious political connections. That's how they got access to surveillance drones and local resources." He stepped back from the truck. "Get going. I'll run interference, tell them I spotted you heading east." "Thank you, Mike," Margaret said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "Just be careful," he warned. "These people play for keeps." As Margaret continued toward the logging trail, she dialed James on the satellite phone, quickly updating him on the new information and their unexpected ally. "Good to know the sheriff's on our side," James said, relief evident in his voice despite the poor connection. "But we've got another problem. Drone surveillance. I've had to go deeper into the woods to avoid being spotted." "Can you still make it to Harvey's?" Margaret asked, concern mounting. "Yes, but it'll take longer. And I'm worried they might have people watching his property too, if they're as thorough as they seem." Margaret thought quickly. "I'll call Harvey, warn him. Maybe he can create a distraction of his own." After ending the call with James, Margaret dialed their neighbor. Harvey Miller answered on the second ring, his gruff voice familiar and reassuring. "Harvey, it's Margaret Wilson. We need your help. It's urgent." To his credit, Harvey asked few questions when Margaret explained the situation in brief, carefully worded phrases. He understood the need for discretion over open communication lines. "So you're saying your husband is bringing a package to my Northfield and some folks might be watching who don't need to see the delivery?" he summarized. "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "Can you help?" "Reckon I can," Harvey replied. "Got a controlled burn scheduled for my southwest field today anyway. Fire department's already been notified. Might just move that up a bit, draw some attention away from the north side of my property." "You're a lifesaver, Harvey," Margaret said fervently. "Jim saved my farm during the '08 crash," Harvey responded simply. "I don't forget my debts." With Harvey's cooperation secured, Margaret felt a tentative hope building. If James could get Elena safely to the airstrip, if Harvey could fly her to the city, if the sheriff's contacts could provide legitimate protection. It was a lot of if, but it was a plan, their best shot at getting Elena and her research into the right hands. As she navigated the increasingly familiar terrain, now less than a mile from where she hoped to intersect with James's path, a sound overhead made her blood run cold. A helicopter flying low, its black silhouette stark against the morning sky. Not news, not medical, not police. This was a private aircraft, and Margaret had little doubt about who it belonged to. The stakes had just been raised significantly. What had begun as a corporate attempt to suppress research had escalated into what felt like a military operation. Margaret pressed harder on the accelerator, mud spraying from the truck's tires as she raced to reach James and Elena before the helicopter did. In the trailer behind the ATV, Elena clutched the metal case containing her research, her expression resolute despite her pain. When she'd stopped to help an accident victim yesterday, Margaret could never have imagined she'd be drawn into this web of corporate espionage and life-saving medical research. But here she was, a farmer's wife from Millbrook County, racing across muddy fields to outmaneuver a pharmaceutical giant with seemingly unlimited resources. The helicopter banked sharply in the sky above, beginning a search pattern that would eventually bring it directly over the logging trail. Time was running out. James heard the helicopter before he saw it. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades cut through the morning air, a sound so out of place in rural Millbrook County that it immediately sent a surge of adrenaline through his system. He guided the ATV deeper into the tree line, using the dense foliage for cover. "There's a helicopter searching for us," he called back to Elena. "We need to stay under the canopy as much as possible." Elena shifted painfully in the trailer. "They're not giving up," she said, her voice tight with pain and determination. "Ascendant has too much at stake." The logging trail had narrowed significantly, forcing James to reduce their already modest speed. Thick branches scraped against the sides of the ATV and trailer, while exposed roots and deep mud pits made for treacherous navigation. Every minute spent in these woods was another minute for their pursuers to close in, but breaking cover meant exposure to the aerial search. James checked the satellite phone Margaret had called him on earlier. The signal was weak under the dense canopy, but it was their only reliable means of communication now. He dialed Margaret's number. "Where are you?" he asked when she answered, his voice low, despite the engine noise that would mask his words from anyone but Elena. "About half a mile from the west entrance to the logging trail," Margaret replied, the connection crackling. "There's a helicopter overhead. I'm staying under tree cover where I can." "Same here," James confirmed. "We're making progress, but it's slow going. Maybe another 15 minutes to Harvey's North Field, if we don't run into trouble." "Harvey's setting up a distraction on the southwest side of his property," Margaret informed him. "Should draw attention away from the airstrip. And Mike Wallace is on our side. He and the sheriff know these people aren't CDC. Real federal agents are on their way, but it'll be hours before they arrive." James absorbed this information, mentally recalculating their odds. "We just need to hold out until Elena's safely away," he said. "Once she and her research are in the right hands, we've done our part." "Be careful," Margaret urged. "I'll meet you at Harvey's as soon as I can." As the call ended, James noticed that the sound of the helicopter had faded slightly. It seemed to be concentrating its search pattern to the east, away from their current position. A stroke of luck, or perhaps the result of Wallace's promised interference. The ATV lurched suddenly as a wheel dropped into a hidden mud pit, nearly throwing James from his seat. He regained control quickly, but the jolt had been severe. "You okay back there?" he called to Elena. Her response was a moment in coming. "Yes," she finally replied, though her voice was strained. "But I think my leg's bleeding again." James cursed under his breath. They couldn't stop now, not with Ascendant's forces so close, but Elena's condition was deteriorating. The rough journey was aggravating her injuries, and they still had some distance to cover. "Just a little longer," he promised. "Harvey's place is close now." As they pressed on, the logging trail began to widen, indicating they were approaching its end. Beyond the remaining stretch of woodland lay Harvey Miller's sprawling property, 500 acres of farmland, including the small private airstrip where Harvey kept his crop duster. James slowed the ATV, listening intently. The helicopter's rhythmic beating was audible again, but distant, likely hovering over another section of the county. The drone was nowhere to be seen. It was now or never. "We're going to make a run for it," he told Elena. "The airstrip is just beyond those trees. Once we break cover, we'll be exposed for about half a mile of open field. I'm going to go as fast as possible without bouncing you around too much." "I'm ready," Elena assured him, gripping the sides of the trailer. Taking a deep breath, James guided the ATV out of the forest and onto the open ground of Harvey Miller's North Field. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, momentarily blinded him after the filtered light of the woods. He squinted, orienting himself quickly. There, about half a mile away, he could see the small hangar and windsock that marked Harvey's airstrip. The ATV surged forward, its engine straining as James pushed it to its maximum safe speed across the uneven ground. Behind them, the tree line receded rapidly. Ahead, the airstrip grew gradually larger. James scanned the sky constantly, expecting at any moment to hear the return of the helicopter. Instead, he heard a new sound, the distinctive pop and crackle of a large fire, followed by a plume of dark smoke rising from the southwest corner of the property. Harvey had come through with his promised distraction. On the opposite side of the property, Margaret emerged from the woods in her pickup truck just as James and Elena reached the halfway point to the airstrip. She accelerated across the open field, aiming to intercept them. At the small hangar, a figure appeared, Harvey Miller, tall and lanky. His weathered face set in a determined expression as he watched their approach. He was already preparing his crop duster, the propeller beginning its slow rotation as the engine warmed up. Margaret reached James and the ATV first, bringing her truck to a skidding halt beside them. "The helicopters moved toward the controlled burn," she reported breathlessly. "But we don't have much time. They'll realize it's a distraction." Together, they carefully transferred Elena from the trailer to the truck bed, where Margaret had prepared a makeshift bed of blankets. The researcher's face was pale, her clothes soaked with sweat and streaked with mud, but her copper eyes remained alert and determined. "The case," Elena reminded them, clutching the metal container to her chest. "It has to stay with me." "It will," James assured her as they drove the final quarter mile to the hangar. Harvey met them with a grim nod, helping them gently lift Elena from the truck bed. "My nephew's a doctor in the city," he told them as they carried her toward the waiting plane. "Already called him. He'll meet us at the airfield. No questions asked." Elena looked up at Harvey, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Harvey replied gruffly. "Still got to get you there. Weather's cooperating at least. Clear skies all the way." As they secured Elena in the passenger seat of the small crop duster, the distant sound of the helicopter changed pitch. It was moving again, returning from the controlled burn site. "They're not buying the distraction anymore," Margaret said urgently. "You need to go now." Harvey nodded, climbing into the pilot's seat. "What about you two? Those people aren't going to be happy when they figure out you helped her escape." James and Margaret exchanged a look. "We'll be all right," James said, though his tone lacked conviction. "The sheriff's called in federal agents. We just need to avoid Ascendant's people until they arrive." "Take this," Elena said suddenly, reaching into the lining of the metal case and extracting a small flash drive, which she pressed into Margaret's hand. "It's a copy of my research and evidence of Ascendant's corporate espionage. If anything happens to me or the original data, this could still expose them." Margaret closed her fingers around the drive, understanding the enormous responsibility Elena was entrusting to her. "We'll keep it safe," she promised. Harvey started the engine in earnest now, the propeller's rotation quickening to a blur. "Better step back," he shouted over the noise. James and Margaret retreated to the truck, watching as the small plane began to taxi toward the runway. The helicopter was visible now, a dark speck in the distance but approaching rapidly. "They're going to see the plane," Margaret said, anxiety tightening her chest. "Not if Harvey's fast enough," James replied, though he too was watching the helicopter's approach with mounting concern. The crop duster picked up speed, bouncing along the modest runway until finally, with what seemed like barely enough distance, it lifted into the air. Harvey banked sharply to the east, keeping low to the ground in an apparent attempt to use the terrain for cover. The helicopter altered course immediately, abandoning its previous search pattern to pursue the small plane. "They've spotted them," Margaret gasped, her hand unconsciously tightening around the flash drive. James was already moving, pulling her toward the truck. "We need to go. Now, there's nothing more we can do for them here." "But Harvey and Elena, Harvey knows these skies better than anyone," James assured her, though his voice was tight with worry. "He's got a head start and knows every valley and ridge to hide in. Our job now is to protect that drive and make sure we're here when the federal agents arrive." As they sped away from the airstrip, Margaret looked back one last time to see the crop duster disappearing over the eastern horizon, the helicopter in pursuit but falling behind. The fate of Elena Reyes, her groundbreaking research, and the kindly neighbor who had risked everything to help them was now in Harvey's hands. "Where to?" Margaret asked as they reached the main road. James considered their options. Going back to the farm was too risky. Mercer and Dr. Vega would surely have people watching it. They needed somewhere safe to wait for the real authorities to arrive. "Sheriff's hunting cabin," he decided. "It's remote, defensible, and only locals know about it." Margaret nodded, taking the turn that would lead them deeper into Millbrook County's wooded hills. As they drove in tense silence, the weight of the small flash drive in her pocket felt immense, a tiny object that could save countless lives and expose a corporate giant's deadly conspiracy. Behind them, the sound of the helicopter faded, but they were under no illusions that the danger had passed. In helping Elena Reyes, they had made powerful enemies, and those enemies were still out there, searching. Sheriff Dennison's hunting cabin was more accurately described as a fishing shack, a modest one-room structure perched on the edge of Millbrook Lake, accessible only by a winding dirt track that most locals didn't even know existed. James and Margaret had been here exactly once, years ago, when the sheriff had hosted a small gathering for his closest friends after his retirement from the Army and returned to his hometown. James pulled the truck as close to the cabin as possible, concealing it behind a stand of pine trees. The small building looked abandoned, its weathered boards gray with age, windows dusty and curtained. Perfect for their purposes. "Wait here," James instructed, retrieving his shotgun from behind the seat. He approached the cabin cautiously, checking for any signs that someone else might have sought refuge here. Finding none, he unlocked the door with the key the sheriff had given deputies and trusted friends for emergencies, though Dennison likely hadn't imagined an emergency quite like this one. The interior was Spartan but clean. A wood stove, a small kitchen area, a table with 4 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Fishing gear hung neatly on hooks, and a shelf held basic supplies like canned goods, matches, and lanterns. James signaled for Margaret to join him, and she hurried across the clearing, constantly scanning the sky for signs of the helicopter. Inside, James immediately began securing the cabin, checking that the wood stove's flue was closed to prevent smoke from signaling their location, drawing the faded curtains, and taking stock of supplies. Margaret sank into one of the wooden chairs, exhaustion suddenly washing over her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the morning was ebbing, leaving trembling muscles and a mind racing with worries. "Do you think they made it?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her since they'd watched the crop duster disappear over the horizon. James paused in his inventory of the cabin's meager provisions. "Harvey's the best pilot in 3 counties, he said. "And he knows this terrain better than those helicopter pilots ever could. If anyone could shake that pursuit, it's him." Margaret nodded, wanting desperately to believe it. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket, turning it over in her hands. Such a small thing to have caused so much chaos, to have put so many lives at risk. "What do we do with this?" she asked. James sat across from her, his expression grave. "Keep it safe until the federal agents arrive. That's our job now. If anything happened to Elena and Harvey..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood that the drive Margaret held might be the only remaining copy of Elena's research and evidence against Ascendant. The satellite phone rang, startling them both. James answered cautiously. "Jim, it's Mike Wallace," came the deputy's voice, tense but steady. "Just checking you and Margaret are okay. Things have escalated here in town." "We're safe for now," James replied. "What's happening?" Wallace's sigh came through clearly despite the connection. "Ascendants brought in more people. They've got private security crawling all over the county, and they've somehow convinced the state police that they're pursuing a dangerous bioterrorist. They're setting up roadblocks on all major highways." Margaret and James exchanged alarmed glances. "What about Sheriff Dennison?" Margaret asked, leaning closer to the phone. "He's doing what he can," Wallace replied, "but his jurisdiction only goes so far. These Ascendant people have some serious political connections pulling strings. The good news is, the FBI agents the sheriff contacted are definitely coming. ETA about 3 hours. The bad news is, Ascendant knows they're coming too." "Any word about a crop duster being pursued by a helicopter?" James asked, unable to keep the worry from his voice. A pause. "Nothing confirmed. There was radio chatter about an unauthorized flight out of the county, but it went silent about 20 minutes ago. Could mean anything." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. 20 minutes ago. That would have been just enough time for Harvey to reach the next county, where his doctor nephew was supposed to meet them. Had they made it? Or had Ascendant's forces somehow grounded them? "Mike, we've got a copy of Elena's research," James said, his voice low despite their isolation. "On a flash drive. If Ascendant's people find us—" "Don't tell me where you are," Wallace interrupted quickly. "Better I don't know, in case they question me. Just stay hidden until the feds arrive. I'll contact you when they're here." The call ended, leaving James and Margaret in silence, broken only by the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall and the occasional call of birds outside. 3 hours, Margaret said finally. "A lot can happen in 3 hours." James nodded grimly. "We've done everything we can for now. Elena and Harvey are either safe or they're not. We can't help them anymore. Our job is to protect that drive." Margaret knew he was right, but the waiting chafed at her. All her life, she'd been a woman of action, raising their children, working the farm, volunteering with the fire department in her younger years. Sitting still while others were in danger went against every instinct. "I should have gone with them," she said suddenly. "In the plane. One of us should have." James shook his head. "And leave the other alone to face Ascendant?" "No. We made the right call. Harvey knows what he's doing." A sound outside, faint but distinct, ended their conversation abruptly. An engine, approaching slowly on the dirt track. James moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. His body tensed. "Black SUV," he reported in a whisper. "Coming up the track." Margaret's heart raced. How had they been found so quickly? Wallace had sworn he hadn't told anyone where they were going, and they'd been careful not to leave an obvious trail. "Back door," James decided, already moving toward the rear of the cabin. "Through the woods to the lake. There's an old boathouse about a quarter-mile down the shoreline." They moved quickly, gathering only the essentials: the flash drive, the satellite phone, a bottle of water, James's shotgun. They slipped out the back door just as the SUV came to a stop in front of the cabin. Moving as quietly as possible, they made their way into the dense woods behind the cabin. Years of working the land had taught them both how to move through forest terrain with minimal disturbance, where to place their feet, how to avoid breaking branches that would signal their passage. They paused behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree, listening. From the direction of the cabin came the sound of the front door being forced open, followed by voices. At least 2 people, maybe more. "Clear the building and search the perimeter," came a familiar voice. Mercer. "They were here, and recently. Find out where they went." "Yes, sir," replied another voice, this one unknown to them. "What about the chopper? Any update on the pursuit?" "Lost visual contact near the county line. Mercer reported, frustration evident in his tone. Local air traffic control reported a small plane making an emergency landing at a private airfield, but by the time our people got there, it was gone, along with whoever was flying it and any passengers. Margaret felt a surge of hope. That sounded like Harvey had successfully evaded the helicopter and perhaps even managed a strategic landing to throw off pursuit before continuing to their actual destination. So Reyes could be halfway to the city by now, the second voice concluded, which is why finding that flash drive is now our top priority, Mercer snapped. Dr. Vega is certain the woman gave a copy to the farmers. Fan out and find them. They can't have gone far. James tugged at Margaret's sleeve, indicating they should keep moving. Silently, they continued their careful retreat toward the lake, each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves behind them sending a fresh spike of adrenaline through their systems. The terrain sloped gradually downward as they approached Millbrook Lake, the forest floor becoming mushier underfoot. The late morning sun sparkled on the water visible through the trees ahead, a serene sight at odds with the danger pursuing them. The boathouse James had mentioned came into view, a dilapidated structure listing slightly toward the water, its wooden dock extending 20 feet into the lake. They hurried toward it, hoping it would provide temporary shelter while they formulated their next move. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and old fish. A small rowboat was secured to one wall, its oars propped beside it. James immediately began preparing the boat, his movements quick but methodical. "We can cross to the far shore," he whispered. "They won't expect that. From there, we can make our way to Dawson's Creek. There's an old ranger's station there, abandoned for years but still solid. We can hole up until Wallace calls with the all clear." Margaret nodded, helping him prepare the boat. But as they worked, her mind kept returning to Elena and Harvey. Had they truly escaped? Was Elena getting the medical attention she desperately needed? And if they had made it to safety, when would Ascendant's pursuit of the flash drive she and James now carried end? Through the slats of the boathouse wall, she caught a glimpse of movement on the shoreline, a figure in dark clothing, scanning the lake edge methodically. Mercer's people were already closing in. "James," she whispered urgently, gesturing toward the approaching searcher. He nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We need to go now. Ready?" Together they pushed the rowboat into the water as silently as possible, wincing at every small splash. As they slipped inside and James began to row with careful, quiet strokes, Margaret found herself thinking of Elena's words earlier that morning. "If we get through this, I promise your kindness won't be forgotten." They were far from through this yet, but one thing was clear. The simple act of stopping to help an accident victim had irrevocably changed their lives. Whatever happened next, there would be no returning to the peaceful existence they had known just 24 hours ago. The old rowboat slipped through the water with surprising quietness, James's decades of experience on this lake evident in each precise stroke of the oars. They kept close to the shoreline where overhanging trees provided cover, making them less visible to the searchers combing the woods around the cabin. Margaret sat in the bow, the satellite phone and flash drive secure in her pockets, James's shotgun across her lap. She scanned the shoreline constantly, her heart jumping at every flicker of movement among the trees. So far, it seemed Mercer's team hadn't spotted them on the water. "There," James whispered, nodding toward a small cove about halfway around the lake. "We can land there and cut through the old logging camp to reach Dawson's Creek." Margaret nodded, remembering the abandoned camp from summer excursions when their children were young. It had been decades since the loggers had moved on, leaving only a few crumbling structures and overgrown paths, but it would provide cover and a route to the ranger's station James had mentioned. As they neared the cove, a sudden mechanical whine filled the air. Margaret looked up, dread pooling in her stomach. The helicopter had returned, appearing over the tree line to the east. It wasn't directly overhead yet. It seemed to be following the main road that skirted the lake about a mile away. but it was close enough to spot them if the pilot happened to look in their direction. "Pull in under those trees," Margaret hissed, pointing to a weeping willow whose branches draped into the water, creating a natural curtain. James changed course immediately, guiding the boat into the shadowy sanctuary. They sat motionless as the helicopter passed overhead, its thunderous noise drowning out even their ragged breathing. Through gaps in the willow's canopy, Margaret could see it hovering briefly over what must be the hunting cabin, then moving in a search pattern outward from that point. "They know we crossed the lake," James observed grimly. "Or at least they suspect it." Margaret nodded, calculating their options. The helicopter complicated everything. Even if they made it to shore undetected, moving through open terrain would be significantly more dangerous with aerial surveillance. "We need a diversion," she said, surveying the boat and its meager contents. James followed her gaze to the small fuel can secured under the center seat. Emergency fuel for the boat's rarely used outboard motor, which they had left behind due to its noise. "It's risky," he warned, understanding her thought process immediately. "If they connect it to us—" "They're already hunting us," Margaret pointed out. "This might at least draw them away long enough for us to reach the ranger station." After a moment's consideration, James nodded. Working quickly and quietly, they prepared their diversion. James soaked his handkerchief in the fuel, stuffing it into the can's opening to create a makeshift wick. Using the boat's emergency kit, Margaret found waterproof matches. "We'll set it adrift heading north," James decided, "away from our actual route. Once it's far enough out, we light it and make for the cove." The plan was simple but effective. They pushed the fuel can out beyond the willow's branches, using an oar to direct it northward, where the lake's current would carry it further away from their intended landing spot. When it was about 50 yards out, James struck a match. "Ready?" he asked, meeting Margaret's eyes. She nodded, tension evident in every line of her body. The match arced through the air, landing precisely on the fuel-soaked handkerchief. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then flames erupted, quickly engulfing the can. The burning container bobbed on the water, drifting northward as planned. "Now," James urged, immediately steering the boat toward their original destination. They reached the cove in minutes, beaching the boat in the soft mud and quickly concealing it with branches and underbrush. Above them, the helicopter had changed course, moving toward the floating fire that was now sending a column of black smoke into the sky. "It worked," Margaret breathed, watching through the trees as the helicopter hovered over their diversion. "But not for long. We need to move." The old logging camp was about a quarter-mile inland, and they moved towards it at a careful but steady pace, sticking to the densest parts of the forest. The ground was still muddy from yesterday's storm, forcing them to step cautiously to avoid leaving obvious tracks. They had just reached the crumbling remains of the camp's main building when the satellite phone vibrated in Margaret's pocket. Ducking behind a wall, she answered it, keeping her voice low. "Margaret, it's Mike Wallace. Are you and James all right?" "For now," she replied. "But Mercer's people found the cabin. We're on the move." Wallace cursed softly. "They've got the whole county on lockdown. Sheriff's doing what he can to slow them down, but they're throwing around federal authority. Fake credentials, but convincing ones. Any news about the FBI, or about Harvey and Elena?" "FBI's still inbound, maybe another hour out." Wallace paused. "As for your friends, I just got word from Sheriff Dennison. He made some calls. Your neighbor's plane was spotted landing at a private airstrip owned by a Dr. Miller in Somerset County. 2 passengers were seen transferring to a car, which then headed toward the city. No reports of any pursuit or interference." Relief washed over Margaret, so powerful she had to lean against the wall for support. "They made it," she whispered, meeting James's anxious gaze and giving him a small nod. "Looks that way," Wallace confirmed, "but you two are still in danger. Mercer's people seem desperate to find whatever Reyes gave you." A sudden noise, A branch snapping nearby caused both Margaret and James to freeze. "We need to go," Margaret whispered into the phone. "Can't stay in one place too long." "Be careful," Wallace urged. "I'll call when the feds arrive." They ended the call and moved deeper into the ruins of the logging camp, their senses on high alert. The helicopter was still visible through gaps in the forest canopy, now moving in a search pattern over the northern part of the lake, far from their current position, but a reminder that the hunt continued. "Dawson's Creek is about a mile that way," James whispered, pointing west. "If we follow the old supply road, we should reach the ranger's station within 30 minutes. Margaret nodded, but as they prepared to move on, the sound of voices reached them, distant but approaching. Mercer's ground team had crossed the lake and was now spreading through the forest, methodically searching. "This way," James urged, leading her toward what had once been the camp's equipment shed. Unlike the other buildings, which had largely collapsed, the shed's metal framework had withstood the decades, creating a maze of rusted beams and corrugated panels. They ducked inside, moving carefully through the debris. James paused suddenly, kneeling to examine the ground. Moving aside, a fallen beam revealed a rectangular outline in the dirt floor. "What is it?" Margaret whispered. "Storage cellar," James replied, already working to clear more debris. "The loggers used it for keeping supplies cool, if I remember right." With a grunt of effort, he lifted the trap door, revealing a dark space beneath. Stale air wafted up, carrying the scent of earth and old wood. "It's not deep," James said, "but it might hide us until they pass by." The voices were closer now, accompanied by the crackle of radios. Margaret could make out fragments of conversation, instructions to search thoroughly, warnings about their targets potentially being armed. Without further discussion, they slipped into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. The space was cramped and pitch black, forcing them to huddle close together. Through cracks in the old door, thin slivers of light penetrated the darkness, enough for them to make out each other's faces, but little else. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her pocket, confirming the flash drive was still secure. So much danger, so much effort, all for this tiny piece of technology and the secrets it contained. Was it worth it? The thought had barely formed when she remembered Elena's determination despite her injuries and the lives that could be saved by her research. Yes, it was worth it. Above them, the voices grew louder, footsteps crunching on the debris-strewn ground of the abandoned camp. Through the cracks in the trapdoor, Margaret could see shadows moving, flashlight beams sweeping across the ground. "Check every building, every possible hiding place," came Mercer's unmistakable voice, so close that Margaret had to stifle a gasp. "They're here somewhere, I can feel it." Another voice, female, Dr. Vega, responded. "The helicopter spotted boat tracks at a cove on the eastern shore. They can't have gone far." "Spread out," Mercer ordered. "You three check that structure. Rodriguez with me. We'll sweep the perimeter." Footsteps approached the very shed they were hiding in. Margaret and James pressed themselves into the corners of the small cellar, barely daring to breathe. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light coming through the cracks as someone walked directly overhead, their footsteps sending small showers of dirt onto the hiding couple. "Nothing here," called a male voice after what seemed like an eternity. "Just ruins." The footsteps receded, but Margaret and James remained motionless, knowing better than to emerge too soon. Minutes ticked by in tense silence, punctuated only by distant voices as the search continued in other parts of the camp. Finally, when no sounds had been heard for several minutes, James carefully lifted the trap door a few inches, peering out. The shed appeared empty, but through the gaps in the walls, they could see figures still moving through the camp, though farther away now. "They're moving toward the west," James whispered, lowering the door again. "Directly in the path we need to take to reach Dawson's Creek." Margaret processed this, her mind racing. "So we can't go that way. What about south toward Miller's Point? Isn't there an old fire tower there?" James nodded slowly. About 2 miles. Difficult terrain, but defensible once we're there. And it has radio equipment, old, but might still work. We could contact Wallace directly instead of waiting for him to call. Then that's our new destination, Margaret decided, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. We just need to wait until they've moved far enough away. As they settled in for another anxious wait, Margaret found herself thinking of their farm, so peaceful yesterday morning, now the epicenter of a manhunt. Would they ever see it again? Or had their simple act of kindness toward a stranger on a stormy highway set them on a path from which there was no returning? Dusk was approaching by the time James and Margaret deemed it safe to emerge from their hiding place. The forest had grown quiet, the sounds of Mercer's search team fading as they continued westward, following the false trail toward Dawson's Creek. The helicopter had disappeared as well, though whether due to refueling needs or a shift in search strategy, they couldn't be sure. "We need to move quickly," James whispered as they climbed out of the cellar, muscles stiff from hours of cramped immobility. "We've got maybe an hour of decent light left, and the terrain gets rough between here and Miller's Point." Margaret nodded, brushing dirt from her clothes. The day's events had left them both filthy and exhausted, but there was no time to rest. She checked her pocket for the 1,000th time, confirming the flash drive was still secure. They set off southward, keeping to the densest parts of the forest where the canopy would shield them from aerial observation. The land began to rise gradually as they approached the ridge that formed the southern boundary of the lake basin. Here, the going became more difficult. Rocky outcroppings and steep inclines forced them to pick their way carefully, using trees and exposed roots as handholds. "I haven't climbed like this in 20 years, Margaret panted as they paused briefly on a small plateau. "Not since we took the kids camping at Eagle Bluff." James managed a small smile, the memory momentarily lightening the gravity of their situation. "You were always better at it than me. Remember how you raced Lisa to the top?" Margaret nodded, her eyes suddenly misty. Their daughter, now a pediatrician in Seattle, would be horrified to know the danger her parents were in. Their son, too, stationed overseas with the Army. Would they ever see their children again? As if reading her thoughts, James squeezed her hand. "We're going to make it through this, Maggie. We've faced tough times before." "Not like this," she replied softly. "Not with people trying to kill us." Before James could respond, the satellite phone vibrated. Margaret answered it quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mike again," came Wallace's voice, tense with urgency. "Where are you?" "Heading to the fire tower at Miller's Point," Margaret replied. "Mercer's people were blocking our route to Dawson's Creek." Wallace was silent for a moment. "Good choice. I've got news. Mixed bag. The FBI team has been delayed. Their helicopter turned back due to mechanical issues and they're driving in from the city now. New ETA is after midnight." Margaret's heart sank. Hours more of evading Mercer's increasingly desperate hunters. "The good news," Wallace continued, "is we've received confirmation that Dr. Reyes reached the FBI field office in the city. She's safe, and she's told them everything, including about the copy of her research that she gave you." Relief flooded through Margaret. Elena had made it. Their efforts, Harvey's courage, hadn't been in vain. "Thank God," she breathed. "So the FBI knows we're not the criminals here?" "Yes, but that doesn't mean you're safe yet. Ascendant's people are getting desperate. They know their window is closing. The sheriff intercepted some of their communications. They've been ordered to recover the drive at all costs before the FBI arrives." "At all costs," Margaret repeated, the implication clear. "Exactly, so stay hidden. Keep moving. The fire tower is a good destination, defensible, with communication equipment. I'll try to get word to you when the FBI gets close." The call ended, leaving Margaret and James to digest this new information as they resumed their climb. "Elena made it," James said, relief evident in his voice despite their own continued danger. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, "but we're not out of this yet. Mercer's team has been ordered to get the drive at all costs before the FBI arrives." James's expression hardened. "Then we'd better make sure we're in a strong position when they find us." The remainder of their journey to Miller's Point was grueling. The terrain grew steeper, the fading light making each step treacherous. Twice they heard the helicopter return, its searchlight sweeping the forest below, but each time the dense canopy concealed them from view. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the base of the fire tower. The metal structure loomed against the star-filled sky, a skeletal silhouette rising 80 feet above the highest point of the ridge. At its top sat a small cabin, once manned during the high fire seasons of summer, but abandoned years ago when newer technologies made such observation posts obsolete. "It looks intact," James observed, studying the tower critically. "Let's hope the same is true for the radio equipment inside." The ladder was old but sturdy, each rung holding firm as they climbed. Margaret went first, the shotgun slung across her back, while James followed close behind. The night air grew cooler as they ascended, a gentle breeze becoming a steady wind by the time they reached the cabin. The door was locked, but the emergency key remained in its hiding place beneath a loose board on the small platform outside, a testament to the isolation of the location and the community's respect for property, even abandoned. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but intact. A desk, a chair, a narrow cot, and most importantly, the radio equipment that had once connected this remote outpost to the ranger station and fire department. James immediately went to work on the radio, checking connections and power supplies. "Solar backup system," he murmured appreciatively. "Good design. Means there might still be juice in the batteries." While he worked, Margaret secured the cabin, locking the door, checking the stability of the shutters on the windows that afforded 360-degree views of the surrounding countryside. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in every direction. The lake glimmered in the moonlight to the north, while the distant lights of Millbrook's smaller communities dotted the landscape to the east and west. Far to the south, the glow of the city illuminated the horizon. "I think I've got it," James announced finally, as a light on the radio console flickered to life. "Power's low, but it should work." Margaret joined him at the console as he adjusted dials and switches with the confidence of someone who had operated similar equipment in his youth. A burst of static filled the cabin, making them both jump. "Miller's Point Fire Tower to Millbrook County Sheriff's Department," James said into the microphone, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Come in, Sheriff's Department." More static then, miraculously, a response. "This is Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Dispatch Officer Jenkins speaking. Miller's Point Tower has been decommissioned. Please identify yourself." "Jenkins, this is James Wilson. I need to speak with Deputy Wallace or Sheriff Dennison immediately. Emergency situation." A pause, then, "Hold for Deputy Wallace." While they waited, Margaret moved to the windows, scanning the darkness below for any sign of pursuit. The forest appeared peaceful, the moonlight casting silver patterns through the leaves. But appearances could be deceiving. Mercer's team could be down there right now, closing in on their location. "James? Margaret?" Wallace's voice came through the radio, tinged with relief. "You made it to the tower?" "We're here," James confirmed. "Radio's working, though the power's weak. Any update on the FBI?" "They're about 90 minutes out," Wallace replied. "But I'm more concerned about Mercer's team. We've lost track of their movements in the last hour. No radio chatter, no helicopter sightings." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Silence from their pursuers was more concerning than open pursuit. It suggested planning, coordination, perhaps a targeted approach rather than the wider search pattern they'd been employing earlier. "We'll keep watch," James assured Wallace. "The tower gives us good visibility in all directions." "Stay alert," Wallace warned. "I'll radio when the FBI crosses the county line. Should be around midnight." After signing off, James joined Margaret at the windows. 90 minutes, he said quietly. "We just need to hold out 90 more minutes." Margaret nodded, but uncertainty gnawed at her. The tower, while providing excellent visibility, was also a perfect target, isolated, with only one way up or down. If Mercer's team found them here, they'd be trapped. As if summoned by her thoughts, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a momentary flash of light in the forest about half a mile away, quickly extinguished. Then another, closer to the base of the tower. "James," she whispered, pointing. "I think they're here." James peered into the darkness, his expression grim as he spotted what she had seen. Flashlights. They're trying to be stealthy, but they're definitely approaching. He reached for the shotgun. "We need to be ready. Once they reach the base of the tower, we're cornered." Margaret's hand went to her pocket, feeling the contours of the flash drive. After everything they'd been through, after all the risks taken, it came down to this. A final stand in an abandoned fire tower, with only a shotgun and their wits against professional killers. "How many do you think there are?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can't tell for sure," James replied, still scanning the tree line. "But based on the lights, at least 4 or 5. Margaret calculated their chances grimly. 2 against 5, with limited ammunition and no backup except a federal team still more than an hour away. The odds weren't good. But as she watched another flashlight beam appear below, she straightened her shoulders. They hadn't come this far to give up now. Elena had fought through pain and fear to protect her life-saving research. Harvey had risked everything to fly her to safety. And she and James had spent the day outwitting some of the most dangerous people they'd ever encountered. "We'll make our stand here," she said with quiet determination. 90 minutes. We just need to hold them off for 90 minutes. James nodded, his eyes reflecting the same resolve. "They've underestimated us at every turn. Let's make sure they regret it one last time." Outside, the flashlights converged, moving with purpose toward the base of the tower. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything hung in the balance. The flashlights at the base of the tower multiplied like fireflies in the darkness. James counted at least 6 distinct beams now, moving with military precision as they converged on their position. "They've found us," he said, voice low and controlled, "and they're not even trying to be stealthy anymore." Margaret moved quickly, gathering the few items in the cabin that might serve as additional protection. A heavy first aid kit that could barricade the door, a fire extinguisher that could provide momentary distraction if needed. Her mind raced, assessing their limited options. The latter is their vulnerability, she realized suddenly. They can only come up one at a time, and they'll be exposed the whole way. James nodded, positioning himself near the door with the shotgun. "We'll have to make every shot count. I've got 4 shells left." The radio crackled to life suddenly, startling them both. "Millers Point Tower, this is Deputy Wallace. FBI team has increased speed. New ETA 60 minutes. Do you copy?" James grabbed the microphone. "We copy, but we've got immediate problems. Mercer's team is already here." Wallace's curse was audible even through the static. "Can you hold them off?" "We'll try," James replied grimly. "Just get those FBI agents here as fast as possible." As he signed off, a new voice called up from below. Dr. Vega, her clinical tone incongruous against the night. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, this is Dr. Vega. I know you're up there. We only want what Dr. Reyes gave you. Hand it over, and you can walk away from this unharmed." Margaret and James exchanged looks, communicating without words their shared disbelief at the transparent lie. "We know she reached the FBI," Margaret called back, deciding to reveal that information in hopes it might discourage them. "It's over, Dr. Vega. Your company's crimes are already being exposed." A pause, then Mercer's voice replaced Vega's. That changes nothing. We still need that drive. Final warning, throw it down now, or we're coming up to get it." "Not happening!" James shouted, his finger steadying on the shotgun's trigger. The response was immediate, a barrage of gunfire directed at the cabin. Bullets splintered wood and shattered one of the windows. James and Margaret dropped to the floor, keeping below the windowsills as glass and debris rained around them. "They're not playing around anymore," James observed unnecessarily, crawling toward another window to get a better angle. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun. In the ringing silence that followed, they heard the unmistakable sound of someone beginning to climb the metal ladder. James moved to the door, positioning himself to fire downward at any attacker who reached the platform. "Stay back," he warned Margaret. "If they make it up here—" "They won't," she assured him, though fear threatened to overwhelm her conviction. The minutes that followed were a nightmare of tension and desperate action. Twice, Mercer's men attempted to reach the cabin. Twice, James forced them back down with carefully placed shotgun blasts that didn't hit the men directly, but made the ladder too dangerous to climb. "2 shells left," he reported, the strain evident in his voice. Margaret checked her watch. 38 minutes until the FBI was supposed to arrive. Too long. They wouldn't last that long. Not with James running out of ammunition and Mercer's team growing more aggressive with each failed attempt. A new sound reached them, the mechanical whine of the helicopter returning. Its searchlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the tower and temporarily blinding them. With aerial support, Mercer's team would have additional advantages they couldn't counter. "We need a new plan," Margaret said urgently. Before James could respond, a different sound cut through the night. Sirens, distant but approaching rapidly. Not just one, but many, their wails echoing across the ridge. "That can't be the FBI yet," James said, confusion momentarily replacing fear. The helicopter's searchlight swung away from the tower, focusing instead on the road below where the sirens were converging. Through a shattered window, Margaret could see a procession of flashing lights. Police cruisers, county vehicles, even civilian trucks and cars, all racing toward Miller's Point. The radio burst to life once more. "Jim, Margaret, it's Sheriff Dennison himself." The older man's voice was tight with controlled fury. "We're coming in hot. Wallace told me what's happening. Half the county's responded to my call for backup." Margaret felt a surge of disbelieving hope. "The whole county?" "These Ascendant folks picked the wrong community to terrorize," Dennison replied with grim satisfaction. "Every deputy, off-duty officer, firefighter, and volunteer emergency responder in Millbrook County is converging on your position. Plus about 24 armed citizens who don't take kindly to outsiders threatening their neighbors." Down below, Mercer's team was clearly reassessing the situation. Their flashlights darted erratically as they conferred. The helicopter hovered uncertainly, caught between continuing its mission and retreating from the approaching law enforcement convoy. "Get down!" James suddenly shouted, pulling Margaret away from the window as a final desperate volley of gunfire peppered the cabin. When it stopped, they heard the sound of Mercer's team retreating, crashing through the underbrush in their haste to escape the approaching reinforcements. Margaret crawled to the window, risking a look outside. The helicopter was already disappearing over the ridge, abandoning Mercer's ground team to whatever fate awaited them. On the road below, the first of the county vehicles had arrived, disgorging armed deputies and volunteers who quickly formed a perimeter around the base of the tower. "They're running," she reported, relief making her voice shake. "Our people are here." The next hour passed in a blur. Sheriff Dennison himself climbed the tower to escort them down, his weathered face tight with concern and righteous anger as he assessed their condition. Below, a makeshift command center had been established, with Deputy Wallace coordinating the pursuit of Mercer's fleeing operatives. "3 of them already in custody," Wallace reported as they reached the ground. "The others won't get far. We've got roadblocks on every route out of the county." As Margaret handed the flash drive to Sheriff Dennison, The tension she'd been carrying for nearly 24 hours finally began to ease. "Elena? Harvey? Are they really safe?" she asked, needing final confirmation. "Safe and sound," Dennison assured her. "Dr. Reyes is already working with federal authorities. Her research is secure, and Ascendant Pharmaceuticals is facing a storm of federal investigations. Their stock is in free fall, just on the rumors alone." James put his arm around Margaret's shoulders, drawing her close. "Then it's over?" Dennison nodded grimly. "For now. The FBI will want statements from both of you, and there may be legal proceedings where your testimony is needed. But the immediate danger has passed." As they were guided to a waiting vehicle, Margaret looked back at the fire tower, silver in the moonlight. It had been their last stand, the culmination of a day that had tested them in ways they could never have imagined when she'd left the farm yesterday morning. "Let's go home," she said softly to James, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. "Home," he agreed, the simple word carrying a weight of longing and relief. 3 days later, Margaret stood on the porch of their farmhouse watching in disbelief as a procession of vehicles turned onto their long driveway. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of debriefings, statements to federal authorities, and medical checkups for the various injuries they'd sustained during their ordeal. They'd been home less than a day, grateful for the quiet and privacy after the intensity of recent events, when Sheriff Dennison had called to warn them they would be receiving some visitors in the afternoon. Margaret had expected perhaps a few officials, maybe even a news crew, given the national attention the Ascendant case was now receiving. What she hadn't expected was this, a convoy stretching nearly half a mile down their rural road. Leading the procession were 20 ambulances, their lights flashing but sirens silent, followed by dozens of cars, trucks, and other vehicles. "James," she called, her voice tight with confusion and a touch of fear. Had something gone wrong? Was this another threat? He joined her on the porch, equally bewildered by the sight. As the first ambulance pulled up in front of their house, the door opened to reveal not emergency personnel, but Elena Reyes herself, standing with the assistance of crutches, her leg properly cast, but her copper eyes bright with the same determination Margaret remembered from that stormy morning. "Elena!" Margaret gasped, hurrying down the steps to greet her. "What is all this?" Elena smiled, gesturing to the convoy behind her. "I told you your kindness wouldn't be forgotten," she said simply. "These are just some of the people who want to thank you." From each ambulance emerged patients and medical personnel, people whose lives had been directly impacted by infections resistant to traditional antibiotics, many of whom would benefit immediately from Elena's breakthrough research. From the other vehicles came neighbors, friends, and strangers, moved by the story of a farmer's wife who had risked everything to help an accident victim on a deserted highway. As the crowd gathered in their front yard, Elena turned to address them. "3 days ago, Margaret Wilson stopped to help a stranger in need," she announced, her voice carrying across the assembled group. "That simple act of kindness may well save thousands of lives. Because of her courage, because she and her husband James stood against powerful forces that would have buried my research for profit, we can now begin clinical trials immediately on a treatment that will revolutionize how we fight antibiotic-resistant infections." The cheer that rose from the crowd brought tears to Margaret's eyes. James's arm slipped around her waist, steadying her as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. "I just did what anyone would do," she whispered, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "You did what you always do," James replied, his voice rough with pride. "You saw someone who needed help and you helped them. Everything else, all of this, that's just the world recognizing what I've always known about you." As the crowd began to approach, eager to express their gratitude personally, Margaret took a deep breath, accepting with grace this unexpected outcome of what had begun as a simple decision to stop on a deserted highway during a gathering storm. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps. And sometimes, kindness creates ripples that travel farther than we could ever imagine.